Hi there, and welcome to another episode of Talks at Rhineland. My name is Patrick Verdonck, and today I'm very fortunate to have with me Jean-Pierre Boudrias, who is the co-founder of Aequatis. Many of you in the industry know JP from his long career in finance, but I'll let JP introduce himself before we get into the questions. Welcome to the program, JP.
Thank you, Patrick. Thanks for having me.
Great. It'd be great if you could talk a little bit about your background before we talk more about what your company's doing today.
Absolutely. So I was a banker and investor in the energy space for well over 20 years. During my last position, I was running North America project finance for Goldman Sachs. And essentially, I saw energy transition accelerate in 2020 and felt that's probably where I needed to go. There was very few things I felt I had left to do in investment banking, and decided, you know what, we'll take the plunge. We'll go and become a developer, and co-founded Aequatis with my long-term partner Ross Warner, who we both worked together at Credit Suisse in the mid-2000s, and decided to focus on the long-term duration storage projects. And we're using hydrogen as our storage medium. We're still early innings, but we're having a lot of fun so far.
That sounds great. Well, if you think about energy supply over the last 100 years that we've had electrification, electricity and energy sources have always come from a variety of different sources. So we've had coal, we have gas, nuclear, all of these have often worked at the same time. When we think about the energy industry going forward, where do you see hydrogen fit into that multitude of different sources? How big do you think its shares, and where do you think it's going to be most effective?
I think what's interesting, right, is when I think about what's likely going to happen in the future, we've seen an influx of wind, solar, all very cheap electricity that has gotten added to the system in the last few years. I think we're going to see more. And then the question becomes, what is the zero carbon source of energy that will balance what renewables can't provide? And obviously, where hydrogen is interesting, it does have this ability with this molecule to effectively replace what the experience we had with fossil fuel. And obviously, that's what we see for hydrogen is really an enabler of more renewables rather than like a solution by itself. And if you think about it that way, you're probably never really going to breach the 10-15% like contribution to the actual megawatt hours generated, where the bulk of it will probably come from other zero carbon sources, namely wind and solar, but also hydro, nuclear, and some of the others that are out there as well.
Interesting. One of the things we've talked about is that you've taken a very methodical approach to developing, and I'm sure that's been informed by the fact that you've spent so many years evaluating developers and the projects they've brought to you on the financing side. Can you talk a little bit about how you and your partner Ross laid out the roadmap for developing these projects and why you think that might be an effective way of going about it?
Well, I think what's interesting, right, is obviously we picked something that was a little bit further out in terms of commercialization and ability to make quote unquote the math work with respect to like where costs are and where they're going and what's needed in terms of revenue opportunity. So it was clear for us from the outset that one would need someone to support the economics. We decided that electric utilities were the best potential source for these types of customers. And obviously, one could take the traditional development approach, i.e., we'll go and secure everything, land, interconnection, and then start thinking about and talking to customers. Unfortunately, that doesn't really work for us. One kind of needs to start at the customer and reverse engineer from there, as opposed to like let's put everything out there so that we're in a position to go talk to them. That is development.
Got it. So if I can summarize it, it's more of a customer-centric approach as opposed to a project-centric approach, where you really start with the end user and work back to where you need to site the project, what you need to build, and then how you're going to go about it.
That's right. And obviously, Ross and I have spent a bunch of time in the electric sector, but also a bunch of time in other sectors as well. And that our approach is probably a little bit closer from how things were done outside of electricity, like versus what we've seen in the electric sector, certainly in the last 15, 20 years.
Got it. Speaking of development, how's it been transitioning from a finance and an investor role to development? What are the things you've liked and what are the things that have been a bit more challenging for you?
I think the freedom to pursue things that only the things that interest you, I think, is the key thing. Obviously, when you're doing a career in finance, you are pursuing projects that come to you. You're sometimes following the direction of clients that you don't necessarily think is the right one. As a developer, you have a little bit of that freedom, but obviously, like what's been challenging is oftentimes it's a little bit of a lonely effort, right? Like you're going on your own, trying to make it happen, and there's not this self-validation you get in these very large organizations where there's a lot of people that are out there helping. So it's a little bit more lonely, but you get your good days, you get your bad days. But on good days, it's very exhilarating for sure.
That's great. Well, touching on the topic of careers, I wanted to ask the question that I ask all guests on the program, and that is, if you were to take a step back and look at your career to date and use that to give some advice to yourself at age 22, 23, what advice would you give yourself for somebody starting out a career in energy and energy transition?
I think what's funny, and I always say that to young folks out there. So when I was 22, 23, I wanted to become a portfolio manager. Obviously, it's quite obvious 25 years later, it never happened. So I think the key is really to keep flexibility. And it's specifically when you think about energy transition, there's a million paths to go down to. Yeah. You want to pick one that is interesting. You want to pick one where it's working with folks that you will relate to. But the most important thing to remember is just be flexible. Opportunities are going to come your way at certain points in your career, and you're going to address them the best you can, make the best decision you think at the time. But there is no specific path that says, well, you need to do this and then that. It's more be flexible. I think it's the one thing I take from my own career. If someone had told me that my career path would have looked this way, I would have never believed it, because quite frankly, those were they were not really interests of mine when I was a 22 or 23-year-old.
Interesting. Well, I think that's very good advice. And with that, I want to thank you for being on the program, and I look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you, Patrick.
Take care.